So that's the end of our short talks, and what we'd now like to do is just open up the debate to all of you, and if anybody has any questions for anyone on the panel or any comments that they'd like to make.
The numbers the doctor mentioned the amount of slaves that was on their way from one part of Africa to the coast to be and they never reached the destination. Right. And also too, I was also very interested to hear the connection which you mentioned about Hitler and the Jews' Holocaust with the Africans as well. And also to another point, I'd like a bit more elaboration on what I thought, this again is through ignorance, not looking into the exploitation of slavery over the years. I never understood that there was, say, black people even living in this part of the country so far back. I thought looking at it was just pre-immigration.
Okay, yeah, on the numbers to the coast, the things about the slave trade is because you're dealing with goods, and that's how they saw it. In fact, when people are in the slave ships, they are counted very carefully, because if any of them were to die, etc., you can actually claim insurance on them. So in fact, it was in the slave owners' interest, the slave ship captains and the slave merchants' interests this is in the time of legalised slavery, to actually keep a record. And they'd often number the slaves, they wouldn't name them. And if you read the journal of John Newton, who was later to write Amazing Grace, his journal, in between letters to his wife, moaning about how loud all the slaves are. Also, numbers talks about different slaves dying. When they die, he says, number 72 died of the pleurisy. He says about a different numbered slave, that she died, although ever since she's been on the boat, she's been hardly alive. And about another slave, he says that he died of the flux, which was very common, which was the bloody flux, a kind of form of diarrhea, which many of the slaves died from. So we don't know the exact numbers, and we'll never know the exact numbers. But that figure of a third of the slaves dying before they went on the march across and in the forts is an estimate. It can't be anything more or different than an estimate. On comparisons to the Holocaust, I don't call the slave trade the African Holocaust. I personally don't. Right? But what I do say is that the ideologies of racism, which Hitlerism and Nazism developed out of things like the slave trade and colonialism. It's the kinds of racisms which were developed there just fed directly into it. And I use for this the writer Sven Lundquist's work, who's talked a lot about just things like the ways in which Britain used technology against people like the Zulus, for instance, and just mass slaughters using Gatling guns or whatever. You know, just the total disregard for human life. And the use of concentration camps by the British in southern Africa, etc., etc. So I'm not saying that slavery equals the Holocaust, and I don't say that, but I do say that some of the methodologies and some of the racisms. And your last point about Black Britons, I think, is exceptionally important. At the end of the 18th century, it's been estimated that there were over 10,000 Black Britons in the British Isles. Many of them came at the end of the American Wars of Independence. They were black loyalists who joined the British Army or the British Navy as a means of escaping slavery. What happened was the British were losing the war, and they actually put out a call saying, anyone that comes and joins us, any slaves that come and join us from the American revolutionary, from the American slaveholders, will get their freedom automatically. And in fact, in one of the rare occasions when the British kept their word, they did give many of those people their freedom. Many of them went to Nova Scotia. Some ended up going to the West Indies, but a lot of them ended up coming to London in particular, in Britain. Also, many black slaves, black servants, slaves were brought over as servants for the rich people, especially from the Caribbean, which is the kind of people that Diana was talking about. But the figures we have is around 10,000 in the 18th century. And in fact, the numbers went down during the 19th century and only really recovered and went up again with the Windrush generation. But there was a consistent amount of, of a few thousand black people throughout Britain. And a lot of my research has been finding some of these people. Like, for instance, my great-great-grandfather was a gardener on an estate in Sussex. And I've traced the fact that there was a black servant on that, who was actually in charge of my father because he was the major domo, the top servant. So this was an occasion where a black servant had actually made him... So there's also very interesting stories which talk about race and class, which I think are very interesting.
Yeah. Also, you just mentioned that the numbers decreased. Have you any indication of why will that be? Because
well, the numbers didn't necessarily decrease. The numbers of visible blacks decreased. What happened was there was a majority male migration. Most of them married white women, and actually, in fact, there are lots of blacks there who are passing for white. Not in a nasty way, saying, well, we can't be black, but much more just in the way they were passing. So in fact, if you're counting a black population, it's probably not going down at all, but the visible black population is, the population that's counted as black. It's quite often in marriage and birth and death certificates, the fact that someone's black is recorded. And that's one of the ways in which we know about this.
okay.
But it's not always recorded, is it, Alan? And that's one of the great problems that we have in trying to research the black population in this country, is the consistent difficulty of being able to identify people in the records.
There's a census record from 1871 about Henry Box Brown, who'd escaped from slavery in 1851 in a box. It's a Manchester thing. In Manchester, he lived in Cheetham in Manchester. You wouldn't know he was black, but actually someone who calls himself Professor Henry B. Brown, and who's married to the woman we found out that he's that person. And we've only just found this out in the last 3 or 4 years. And he's a very famous black American abolitionist. And if we're only finding out about very famous black abolitionists in the last 3 years, there's many more thousands out there to find.
And there's actually the reverse problem early on, which people are sometimes called dark or black when they're not. In very early records, 16th and 17th century records, so it's a complicated business.